Welcome back. In today's lecture, we're going to be taking a look at the moral theory feminism. And feminism is, as a moral theory, is something that has been getting a lot more attention in recent decades. It's been in more and more. It's being put into textbooks and it's being discussed in college classrooms as a moral theory. And remember, though, that with feminism, when you put that ism on it, when you put the ism on the back of a word and it becomes a worldview, there's a lot more to feminism just than the moral theory itself, which is going to be true of all the worldviews. It's going to be true of the different moral theories that we're looking at. In our case, for example, we're not going to be talking about the political position that sometimes goes along with the worldview of feminism. We're going to be focusing on the moral theory itself. And so if you're someone who has had negative experiences with feminism, or perhaps you've had really positive experiences with feminism as well, whichever one happens to be your position, whichever one happens to be the experiences that you've had, be they good or bad, when it comes to feminism, try to remember to put those experiences to the side as best you can. And we really want to hear what feminism has to say to us about moral theory, both its positive and its negative. And so at first we're going to be talking about what it does have to offer, and then when we get to the end we'll talk about some weaknesses of it as well. And so as with all moral theories, there's good parts and there's bad parts, and understanding feminism can really help us as we start to move forward and looking at other theories. It'll really help us to understand some of the other more classical moral theories, to help us to realize some of the weaknesses, some of the things that perhaps were ignored for hundreds of years within those other theories, as we'll see kind of how that starts to shake out with feminism. They have a lot to offer, and we need to be sure that we hear them well, and we accept the things that they do in fact have to give to us as well. Okay. So for many centuries, women's voices were unheard in the academic world of moral thought. That's changed pretty radically over the last few decades. Women's moral voices have been heard more and more, and they're starting to develop the idea of the feminist moral approach to ethics. And so it's developing more and more as it goes along. And that's one of the great things about academia and the way it can take different things, old ideas that have been around and discussed for hundreds of years. They've been honed and they've been kind of made cleaner. And so with feminism, because it's a more recent development, it's not as clean cut, it's not as well shaven a theory. And so as it has come into the world of academia and has been taken seriously, they've started trying to hone in and trying to clean it up and say, okay, that's not exactly what we meant. Here's what we meant, right? This is a more accurate description or a more accurate approach to the ideas that they're trying to express. And so it's coming along, it's cleaning up, and it's definitely making progress. And so here within feminism, with the coming of women's voices into the academic world of ethics, new ideas have gained attention from men and women. A dominant form of contract theory today avoids these kinds of distortions, but it does so at a high risk, at a high cost, is what feminists say. Now, right away, I need to talk briefly here about social contract theory. Really what that means is that the idea behind a social contract theory is that if you're part of a society, you're within that social group, you, in essence, sign a contract. By remaining inside that society, you agree to behaving according to the contract's rules. Now, there is no contract that you're signing, but by staying there within the society, you agree, hey, I'm going to follow the rules of this particular society. And the idea here is that if you step out of line, then the society has the right and the ability to try to bring you back into line. Because of the social nature of humanity, we are social creatures, and so there is that that contract, that thing that we all have to understand, hey, this is the proper way to behave within our society here. And so with that contract theory that has been around for several hundred years now, that the idea of the social contract theory has been around. What the feminists say here is that we lose something if we focus too stringently on just the contract. We really risk having lost something tremendously important, and that's what the feminists are going to point out to us, as we'll see as we move forward here. Rawls is an important moral philosopher, and his particular theory, his moral idea of trying to figure out how we should make moral rules, what he said is that we need to put ourselves behind a veil of ignorance. So I'm going to explain here what Rawls is trying to tell us, and then we'll see the feminists and how they counter what he's trying to say. So Rawls wants us to stand behind a veil of ignorance, and what he says is that the best way to come up with moral laws or moral rules or a social contract is to imagine that you are standing behind a veil, like behind a curtain, behind a screen, and you know nothing about yourself. You don't know your gender, you don't know your economic status, you don't know if you're rich or poor or middle class. You don't know what race you are. You don't know anything about who you are. And so he argues here that what you would do is that without any kind of knowledge of who you are, you wouldn't try to give yourself any kind of advantage. And so say, for example, that you knew that you were wealthy. If you knew that about yourself, you might be tempted to set up the laws in such a way as to give wealthy people an advantage. And so what Rawls argues for here is that when you stand behind that veil of ignorance and you know nothing about yourself, you don't know that you're wealthy, you're not going to try to give wealthy people an advantage, because when you step out into the world, when you step away from this veil of ignorance, you might discover that you're poor, and then the poor people are not getting a fair shake because you set up the rules in such a way that wealthy people were getting some kind of advantage there, within the rules. And so Rawls argues that we should stand behind that veil of ignorance where we know nothing about ourselves, and that way we would make rules that are as fair and that would give no one any kind of advantage as possible. So he says, stand behind that veil, know nothing about yourselves, and then you could produce some kind of rules that are just. And so when you step out from behind the veil and then you discover that, hey, you're a female, well, guess what? Women have kind of an equal chance as men, because you would set up those rules just in case you're this race or that particular gender or religion or you name it, right? Whether you're short or tall or whatever it might be, you're going to set it up as fairly as possible because you want to make sure you get as good a chance as everybody else. All right, so that's what Rawls is going to say. The feminists say that there is something odd about that, though. That there is the need for such a contract is created by stripping oneself of all individual identity. The social contract is in effect an answer to a problem that it has created itself. And what they mean here is that what's strange here to the feminist is that it seems like with this social contract that has been set up, they're going to argue, the feminists are going to argue that it seems like the rules are being made in a world that is full of strangers with which we have no relationships whatsoever, and so the rules are going to be cold and calculating and just trying to make sure that they're fair and balanced isn't going to be sufficient, because what the feminists say is that that's not the world that we live in. We live in a world where we have relationships with people, and rather than living in a world where it's just strangers who, because of these rules, the rules that Rawls and the Veil of Ignorance would have set up, that somehow we don't live in a world of strangers where they're all having equal power, but instead we live in a world where we have relationships with each other. And the feminists are going to argue here that the rules should be set up and based on not strangers, but set up on the fact of that we do have relationships, And what we want to do is we want to maintain the relationships rather than make sure that necessarily cold calculating justice is served. And so instead of, hey, we have these rules and we have to follow these rules, instead the feminists say, hey, we have these relationships. That's the world that we actually live in. That's the world that we actually care about. So instead of just having these rules over here that everybody has to follow, instead we have all these relationships, and we should strive to try to maintain the relationships. And so she says that the feminists are saying here that when we come into this world as children, as babies, we have relationships from the beginning where we learn and we are taught trust. And so she says that the real fabric of society is trust. It is relationships. And it is not the idea of a social contract. Well, you're part of this society and therefore you have to act in these ways. And instead, what we should be doing is we should be focusing on that relationship, on the relationship itself, not on the rules of the society. Okay. All right, so one of the things that the feminists point out is that a lot of the different moral theories will often set up a kind of a choice scenario. So imagine that there's two trains on two different tracks, and tied to those tracks there is your mother on one of them, and I'll say Gandhi is tied to the other track. You don't have time to save both of them, you can only save one. And a lot of the more traditional moral theories would they would say you have to save Gandhi. So say utilitarianism, for example. The basic premise, the basic idea of utilitarianism is that you should strive to do the greatest amount of good for the greatest number of people. And so how many people have had a lot of good done for them by the work of Gandhi? And the answer is many thousands, if not millions. I mean, I don't know the exact number, but a lot of good has been done by this man. And so then, by the same token, look at the good that has been done by your mother. How many lives has she reached? And is there a greater amount of good that she could do if you saved her? Or is there a greater amount of good that Gandhi could do if you saved him and he continued to live and work? Well, the answer for utilitarianism here seems to be that you should save Gandhi. The feminists are looking at that and they're going to say, no, you've misunderstood what the most important aspect of the moral theory here is. The most important aspect of the moral theory is the fact of that you're the one who's doing this. And so some of the more traditional moral theories seem to downplay the importance of the role of the actor. And so with utilitarianism here, as we're using it as the example, it's less important the fact that I'm making the decision is much less important in the utilitarianist view than it is within the feminist view. The feminists are going to say, no, you're the one who's making this decision, and you're going to have to live with the fact that maybe you went over here and you saved Gandhi instead of saving your mother, and this relationship over here is the most important relationship to you. I'm much more fond of my mother. I have spent much more valuable time and had more experiences with her than with Gandhi, and so you should do this because this is the relationship and you should maintain that relationship. You don't have a relationship with Gandhi, at least I don't. So in this case, the feminists are saying that these traditional theories are way too focused on the consequences or the outcome of a moral decision, but they seem to be neglecting the fact that there is a person who's making the decision, and there should be a lot more focus put on the fact of, and this person is making the decision, and that's as significant as the consequences of the decision that's being made. And so what you see here is in some of these more traditional theories is that they are cold and calculating and sometimes very stringent and strict on just follow these rules. And feminism is trying to bring in a warmer and a more, I'm going to say, human or perhaps even humane idea of No, what's really important here is that we maintain these relationships. All right. All right, so moral theory, many feminist moral philosophers maintain, must concern itself much more directly with the details of everyday moral experience and abandon its refuge in illusory universality and impartiality. And the idea here is that with a lot of these other more traditional theories, they do look for universal moral laws that individuals should follow. So again, with utilitarianism, the greatest good for the greatest number of persons. And that's that kind of universal rule that many of the moral theories were trying to come up with. And so we'll see the same thing in deontology with Immanuel Kant, doing your duty, doing the thing that you should do under these any circumstance. And so Kant, for example, is going to say, don't lie, that lying is wrong, and so never lie. And it's kind of a universal in Kant. It's not kind of, it is a universal in Kant. He's saying, don't do it, never do it. It's universally wrong, and therefore never do it. And within feminism, what they're saying is that we shouldn't be looking for it necessarily and trying to find those kinds of universals, because it's much more complex. Morality is much more complex than that, and perhaps what we need to be doing is not looking for that kind of universal law, but instead trying to find and maintain the relationships that we have. They also say that we should avoid the idea of impartiality. If you remember one of the past lectures, I said that Aristotle said that the law is reason without passion. Now, the idea here is that if you remember Lady Justice, she's the one that stands on the courthouse steps, and in her right hand she holds a sword because she has the power, the sword representing the authority and the power, the ability to uphold the law, right? So she can use force to maintain the laws. She also, in her left hand, she holds a scale, and there the idea is that she's balancing the evidence, right? So balancing the idea of guilt or innocence. And so she can feel the scale tipping one way or the other. And then on her face, she has a blindfold. And the idea here is that justice is blind, that it can't see your gender, it can't see your race, it can't see your economic status, it can't see anything like that. And so there is the idea of that justice is impartial, that it's not going to show you leniency because you are, say, wealthy. And so the idea here within feminism, once again, is that idea from Aristotle that justice, that the law is reason without passion. Again, the feminists are saying that's much too cold, it's much too calculating. There has to be more to it. There's got to be a more human approach to this, because it's humans that are doing these things, and it's humans that are being affected by them. And so they want to make sure that there is that human element, that there's that humanitarian aspect within this, making sure that it's not just that kind of blind justice where we execute the laws and we execute discipline within the laws without any kind of human understanding or any kind of compassion towards the individuals that we're perhaps punishing or that we're perhaps imprisoning or whatever it might be. So the feminist moral theory is much more likely to proceed from so the idea here is that we're trying to bring in something that's a lot warmer, that we're trying to bring in something that's a lot more humane, more human. All right, now Carol Gilligan is an important feminist moral philosopher. Her work has had profound impact on our understanding both of women's moral experiences, and she has developed an ethic of care based on the concept of moral voices. And so within feminism, within their particular moral perspective, the idea is that the phrase that floats around often is, it's an ethic of care. It's an ethic of care. And we hear that a lot because, remember, we're maintaining those relationships. We're trying to be more humane. We're trying to be more human, less cold. And so remembering that we do care about ourselves and about the relationships that we have with others who are around us. But she also gave us an important phrase that many moral feminist thinkers have embraced, which is the idea of moral voices. And so moral voices, as opposed to something like a moral law or a moral code, again, something like the moral law or the moral code is cold and calculating. And here with the moral voices, what it does is it gives us something that's more, I guess I'm going to stick with the word humane or warm or whatever those things might be. In 1982, Gilligan published a collection of articles as a book. It was entitled In a Different Voice, A Psychological Theory in Women's Development. It's had a profound impact in many different fields of study, including philosophy, religious study, clinical psychology, communication studies, history, political science, literature, and art criticism are some of the things that it has had an impact on. But within this writing, within her concept here of a moral voice, she starts talking about how a moral voice, instead of a moral theory or a moral law or a social contract, the idea here is that there's not necessarily a right voice or a wrong voice. Voices are different. They're different, but that doesn't mean that the ones that don't line up with this particular rule or law or whatever are necessarily wrong. It's just that voices are different. And, she says, we can come together, even with these different voices, and we can find some kind of harmony in which all voices can be heard. Now, if you've ever sung with a choir, or if you've ever really listened to choirs sing, especially a cappella, like large groups of a cappella singers, what you'll find is that the voices are different. They are different, and they bring something to the choir because of the nuances of the different voices. They all bring something to the group that without them simply would not be there. And so it's a richer choir for having had different voices. If all the voices were the same, we would have that kind of just, again, that kind of cold, straightforward, and this is the only thing you'd be hearing. But instead, because we have all these different voices, they come together and they harmonize. And when they harmonize, you get a much more beautiful production because of the richness and the difference. And so rather than that detracting, it actually will enhance the morality of a society as well. If we'll listen to the different voices, if we listen to the different perspectives, we'll have a more rich, we'll have a more nuanced and more morally balanced society, rather than just this one voice, this one cold, calculating, idea that supposedly is supposed to dominate our society, especially in our moral thinking. And she's going to say that that's the reality. That's where we live. We live within a community where that is the case, and so we should embrace it and listen to them, and we should kind of have that harmony allowed and encouraged in our society as well. She claims that voices, the idea here of moral voices, right, can combine both emotion and content. Voices are described and assessed in a wide range of evaluative terms, most of which have little or nothing to do with true, false, right, or wrong. Voices may be strong, weak, low, or high. Right? So you've got all these different voices. The idea here is that there's not really a moral right and wrong per se within the voices. The idea is that we listen to each of those voices, and we, just as voices vary, the ideas within the community are going to vary. But again, if we listen and we harmonize, that's going to enrich the entire society. Finally, voices may be different without excluding one another. Think of the ways people sing together. Their voices blend like a choir. There can be harmony. There can be a melody that's tossed back and forth. Some can take the lead. Others can remain in the background. Also, think about this in regard to yourself. If you were asked to describe your moral theory, it would probably be in impersonal language that gave little clue to who you are as an individual. And so, I don't know if you've ever sat down and tried to figure out your own moral theory, I have, but then I tend to think about this stuff and do it for a living. So I've sat down and thought about my own moral theory and and trying to comprise it, trying to put it together in a package so that I could explain it to someone, especially after after they said, imagine trying to do this, and I sat down and I tried to do it. And it's a difficult thing to do, to simply sit down and describe your moral theory to someone. And in fact, they point out that chances are, if you did sit down and you put together your moral theory and then you presented it to your friends and your family, a lot of them wouldn't recognize it necessarily as yours, because it is so just structured. It's just a theory and a structure rather than reflecting who you are. So if you were to describe not your moral theory, but instead trying to describe your moral voice, maybe that would be a description that your friends and family could probably recognize, because it would be more personal. It would reflect more of who you are and less of some type of, again, cold calculating theory on the other hand. And so the idea there being that this moral voice really is going to reflect more of who we are than, say, a moral theory would reflect who we are. And so they're wanting us to start pulling away from just the theory and start moving more towards that moral voice. Gilligan's studies showed that women tended much more often than men to see moral life in terms of care rather than justice. And remember, I said that this is an ethic of care. When you start studying the more traditional moral theories, what you're going to find is that justice is the driving force. And as it turns out, men have been the ones who have created the more traditional moral theories that have been handed down for hundreds of years. And so they do focus primarily on trying to find a way to justice, whereas when feminists started working in the field of moral theory, because women tend to be more concerned about maintaining relationships than men do, then their moral theory started going more towards maintaining that relationship. And what we found is that it's simply the difference in the way men and women tend to think, and the way they tend to behave. Men tend to seek justice. Women tend to seek to maintain a relationship. Now, if you've ever tried raising and disciplining children with someone of the opposite sex, right? So I'm married and here we are, we're raising these kids. The kid does something they should not have done. How do we punish, or how do we try to teach this kid, you can't do that, or if you do that, here are the consequences, or how do we do that? And what tends to happen is that when wife and I, we sit down and, all right, this is what they did. What are we going to do? And I have found that I tend to say, well, they broke the rule, and here's the punishment. And she'll kind of, I'm not sure about that. That might be a little too much punishment. And so, because she wants to make sure that we don't be counterproductive or overly harsh with the punishment, I tend to be much more, kind of straightforward on, well, this is what they did, and it's cold and calculating. It really is. Well, that's what they did, so that's what they deserve. And they know the rules. They knew the rules when they did what they did. So here's the consequence. And she tends to soften that aspect and say, well, maybe instead of this, maybe there's something here, right? So what we find is that, for the most part, now it's not always going to be true, but we find that generally men tend more toward justice and rule following, and women tend more towards maintaining relationships. Again, that's not always true. In fact, my mother, she's a rule follower, a rule setter, and if you just follow the rules, right, then she's going to be pretty happy, and she's leans much less towards the feminist perspective and the maintaining relationships. She leans harder towards justice, and I think even harder towards justice than my own father. and perhaps even further towards justice than I lean myself. And so it's not always the case that men and women are just divided and this is the way it's set up. But for the most part, it tends to be that men are justice seekers and women are seeking to maintain the relationship. So men see things as moral issues when they involve competing claims about rights, whereas women see problems as moral when they involve suffering of other people. So for men, if a right or if a rule has been violated, justice comes in. For a woman, most of the time, lots of time, what they're going to see is the suffering of the individuals, not just per se the victims, but also even of the ones who are perpetrating, who are somehow trampling on the rights of those other individuals. Women are going to see the suffering of the individuals who are doing the trampling. I mean, it tends to be how the female mind works, at least more so than the male mind, most of the time. Men see the primary moral imperative as centering on treating everyone fairly, whereas women see the moral imperative as centering on caring about others and about themselves. Again, fairness versus compassion or caring. Men typically make moral decisions by applying rules fairly and impartially, whereas women are more likely to seek resolution that preserve emotional connectedness for everyone. Similarly, men tend to look back and judge whether a moral decision was correct or not by asking whether the rules were properly applied, whereas women tend to ask whether relationships were preserved and whether people were hurt. The quality of the relationships, rather than the impartiality of the decisions, is the standard for evaluating decisions for women. Again, just another way of saying this is what women focus on, this is what men focus on. The meaning of responsibility also changes. For men, being responsible is primarily a matter of being answerable for actions. You did this, and so now you have to answer for what you did. For having failed or having followed or failed to follow the relevant rules. And again, there's rules. For women, the focus of responsibility is in taking care of the other person, including and sometimes even emphasizing their feelings. Moreover, it is directed towards what towards what the other person actually feels and suffers, not what anyone would experience. Responsibility is directed towards real individuals, not to some abstract codes of conduct. Again, the men tend to focus on that code of conduct. The women are going to look at it and say, what about the actual people who are being affected by these codes? And so it's a very much a different way of thinking. Much of this theory reflects on deep differences between men and women in ways they conceive of themselves. Men look to rules and roles. Women tend to look more toward connectedness and to the plight of others. Again, not everyone fits into these categories neatly. Tends to be for the most part. A clear theme emerges throughout feminist moral theory. Moral voices are voices of care, whether it's narrowly defined as for one's own survival or the altruistic care of others. The idea is that we include both ourselves and the others, and so as we're making moral decisions, it's not about the rule or the code of conduct. It really is about the individual making the decision and the individual that's being affected by the decisions as they're being made. We're not looking for any kind of universal codes here. We're trying to make sure that we maintain these relationships. Okay, so I think it's really important that we do understand the ethic of care, and that we do begin to understand that there is the individual that is being affected by the different moral decisions within the moral system. I think that's absolutely imperative. What feminism has brought to the moral table here is highly significant. I think that it's something that as we're studying the other more traditional views, as you look at them and you begin to see the cold calculatingness of those codes, and we'll bring it up again as well, that sometimes they do forget about the people who are within the system. And that's an easy thing for people to do. I know it's an easy thing sometimes for me to do, but part of what we're trying to do within feminism is make sure that we don't throw people away, that we give them the opportunity, and we make sure that we understand that there is a human who's standing there in front of us, rather than just they broke the rule and therefore they're out. That there's much more to it than just they broke a rule, and so I think that brings a tremendous perspective that was lacking for a very, very long time. I think that's something tremendous that feminism has brought to the moral discussion. And so we want to be sure that when we recognize that and keep it in mind as we're moving forward when we start studying some of the more traditional ones. Okay, now the weaknesses for feminism. All moral theories have them, and so I'm going to discuss, I believe, 6 of them here for feminism. So the first weakness for feminists. The feminist ethic of care threatens to restrict the scope of moral community too greatly. Care ethicists argue that we have moral duties only to those that we care about. Now, this is one of those particular arguments against feminism that the feminists saw, and they saw, yes, that's a problem, and most of them have begun to abandon it. And the idea here is that for many people, for this particular weakness, many people were pointing out, look, one of the best things that has happened within moral theory work is that we have begun to expand our understanding of a moral theory away from just us, away from just ours, away from just our community or our country or our family or whatever else, but rather we began to recognize the humanity of all individuals globally, regardless of the race and religion and the culture and the country and all of these different things, that we've expanded it beyond that. One of the things that in the earlier part of feminism is that they were saying, well, we should be worried about an ethic of care. Well, what about those individuals who are out in the world that I don't know, that they really are strangers? And in a way, I really don't care about them. It's not that I wish them harm, it's just that I don't care about them in the same way that I care about the individuals that I do know. I have my family, I have my friends, and these individuals that I do care about. And if I see someone over here who's experiencing tragedy, I might feel bad for them, but it's not the same, and we want to be sure that we don't begin to exclude again, because for a very, very long time there was that kind of exclusion. Well, they're not one of us, and therefore we don't have to care about them, or they don't have the same rights that we have because they're not one of us. By including more people, trying to include all people, that's a tremendous step forward in moral theory. In feminists, the idea there at first was beginning to restrict. It ran the risk of restricting it less. It ran the risk of restricting the moral theory of care only to those people that we really knew and cared about. And so we wanted to make sure that we didn't take a step back in moral theory and restrict it again. And so this weakness was pointed out. Many of the feminists, looked at it and said, yeah, that's true, that's right. And so they're trying to make sure that they expand it, right? All right, second weakness. The role of emotions in helping us to know the right thing to do and in moving us the role of emotions in helping us to know the right thing to do and in moving us to do it needs further exploration. Sometimes emotional investment is good. Remember that the feminists here, they're saying, yeah, there should be more, because we need to recognize and we need to understand the emotions of the individual, not just the victims, but the emotions of the person that perhaps violated the rule as well. We need to be sure that that there is that human here in front of us. That's important. That's good. But on the other hand, recognizing that emotion sometimes can cloud our judgment if we let the emotion dominate our view. If that's all we consider, then it can get in the way of us making a good judgment. So we need a view in where emotions are put in their appropriate place, where they're not clouding our view too much or too often, because there does need to be an aspect of justice that goes along with moral theory, and it can't just be the fact of that we're trying to make sure that we're we can't let emotion necessarily get in the way sometimes. So there's got to be some kind of balance in here where, yes, we care about the emotions of these individuals, but we also have to be able to do some type of just action as well. And so one of the individuals pointed out that anger can blind a person, and so that kind of emotion can blind you. On the other hand, it can also shine light. And so emotions can be both good and they can be bad, but we have to somehow make sure that we're using them appropriately. We shouldn't simply throw them out when it comes to moral theory, but we can't let them simply dominate either. So there has to be some kind of give and take in there. All right, weakness number 3. Downgrading impartiality has its cost. Impartiality is a virtue of judges and others who hold positions of civic responsibility. It is an important corrective for prejudice and bias, right? And so remember that there with that veil of ignorance, that Rawls was trying to encourage us to be impartial, and many of the feminists came back and said, no, that we should embrace who we are. We should embrace the gender and the nationality. We should embrace all those different things. We should know who we are as we're making these types of moral rules, because the moral voice is what matters, right? On the other hand, you don't necessarily want a judge who can't see past their own gender, past their own race, past their own social status or their economic status. We have to have a judge that can be impartial, that sometimes is blind and does not punish simply because the other person is not like them, or even a judge that might punish because the person is like them, right? I mean, you're one of us, and therefore I'm punishing you more harshly because, of these reasons here. So sometimes you do need some type of impartiality where the judge is blinded in a sense to the other individual's, again, race or religion or economic status or social status or whatever it might be. And so impartiality does have its benefits as well. So you can't just throw it out and say, look at the person and judge the person as the person is. Sometimes you have to have those kinds of impartial judges as well. So it does have advantages. It is important. We can't simply throw it out. All right, weakness number 4. Rejecting any supreme moral rules leaves it hard to know how to solve moral conflicts. Now remember that the feminists here were telling us we're not looking for some kind of universal rule. The trouble here being is that we kind of need those universal rules, those universal principles that give us a standard. Now, when we say the word standard, what we mean here is that we have to have a way of looking at a person's actions and saying, basically, if you do these things, there's some type of consequence that goes along with it. We can't simply leave it up to the moment where we say, well, today we are going to do this. Now, yesterday, here's how we punished this action, but today, here's how we're going to punish this action. Yesterday, the punishment for speeding was a $10 fine. Today, the punishment for speeding is you lose a leg. Something like that. So there has to be some type of standard out there that allows us to say, and this measures up basically. Now, it doesn't have to be, an exact, you did this and therefore exactly this. It can have some type of variation to move up and down. But there has to be a way for us to decide, within this range of punishment, here is what you are going to get because of your actions, right? And so we need some type of universal laws. We need something that is that will allow that we're not confused, that we're not just constantly wandering around trying to figure out how we should or shouldn't punish an individual who's done these things. And so you can't simply just throw out the universal moral rule. It's going to be something that we're going to need that. There's got to be some type of way of measuring within our moral parameters here. All right, so weakness number 5. While cooperation is often an excellent thing, we also need to have strategies for dealing with uncooperative people or governments. Now, Within the feminist ethic of care and trying to maintain those relationships, one of the things that seems to be less addressed is the idea here of that not everybody is going to try to maintain those relationships, and not everyone's going to embrace the ethic of care, that we should be caring and concerned about these other individuals. We know from living here, as the feminists are talking about, this is the world that we live in. We know that there are going to be uncooperative people who are going to misbehave and not abide by the ethic of care, and not try to maintain the relationships. And in fact, we see that almost everybody at some point will abuse someone else within that relationship in order to get something that they want. And so simply saying we should maintain relationships is not necessarily always going to work. There's got to be a way to say, okay, this person has broken the relationship. Now, how do we deal with them because they've broken it? Perhaps they broke it again and again and again, and eventually we're going to have a way of saying enough. So, what's a process that we could use to deal with those uncooperative people or uncooperative governments? And feminism doesn't really seem to have an answer for that, because it's focused on the ethic of care and it's focused on maintaining the relationship. The world would be a much better place if we were all able to get along and put our differences behind us, but as we all know, good faith and flexibility are sometimes met with a sneer and an iron fist. We need to plan for such occasions. Caring for our enemies will sometimes mean they kill us, or that they will kill those who we are entrusted to protect. And so, yes, it would be great if everybody could get along, but they can't. So how do we deal with these situations where these individuals are continuously not abiding by the idea of an ethic of care? Yes, and further within this, that competition sometimes can be a good thing. Sometimes it's good when communities compete, or people compete, or even nations compete, because what that will do is it will enhance the efficiency of business. So a business will streamline. It'll cut off all of the unnecessary weight. If there's competition, they're going to try to stay in the best shape that they can possibly stay in, so that they can continue to be the better business and continue to grow and expand. And so it's not necessarily a bad thing that people compete and try to get ahead of others, whereas within the ethic of care, perhaps you would always be trying to put the other person's needs ahead of yourself. That's not necessarily always a good thing. Within business, again, it can be a really, really good thing that you don't try to put the other person ahead of yours, but that instead you try to one-up them, because then they'll try to one-up you, and what we get is just a better business model, because constantly the businesses are trying to trim down and get better and get sleeker and get better. So the same thing is going to be true certainly in our personal lives, that within any type of competition, that it makes people better because they're competing. And so I remember watching something about the Chicago Bulls when they were really trying to start winning championships. The Pistons were constantly keeping them from winning. Like the Pistons were always beating them, until eventually, because of the fierce competition of the Pistons, the Bulls took their training and took their level of competition to a higher place. And during interviews, a lot of the athletes on the Bulls team said that we would never have achieved the things that we achieved if the Pistons hadn't been driving us, if they hadn't been just driving us to be better and be better and be better. And so competition within business, or competition between people, can definitely be a good thing. It can be healthy, it can be useful, as long as it's shaped correctly. So competition is not always necessarily a bad thing as well. Okay. And finally, the sixth one, so weakness number 6. While justice and rights are not the whole of morality, they are a very important part of it. And so the feminists here seem to want to replace the idea of justice, and they seem to want to replace the idea of rights with that ethic of care. And it's it's not necessarily it's not going to be a healthy thing to simply to replace it, to remove justice or to remove the idea of rights. And as it turns out, even within even those individuals who are embracing the feminist position, um, they are in need of the idea of justice and rights. After all, um, don't women have the right not to suffer physical abuse? Isn't that a right? Don't they have the right to speak and to say that freedom of speech? That's a right that females and feminists have. Certainly, that's going to be the case. But those are rights, and if you're going to be in the feminist camp and you're going to say we shouldn't be worried about rights, well, but what about that right that you have not to be physically abused, or the right to free speech? Those things are rights that are there, and there are those individuals who are focused on making sure that justice is served, which means that they maintain those rights. It's just, it's right that they get to keep those rights. Well, you can't decry or say, ignore these things all the while those things are precisely what's letting you be able to do and say what you're doing and saying. And so it really is important that we understand and we maintain that there is such a thing as human rights, and that justice should be served and it should be upheld. And so sometimes the feminist position can detract those things so far as to say, we shouldn't be focused on justice, we should be focused on the ethic of care. Well, but there is a need for justice, and there is a need to make sure that we're maintaining the rights. And in this case, the feminists are benefiting from that sense of justice and the sense of maintaining human rights as well. So we want to make sure that there is somehow within there that kind of balance. And of course, that's the tricky part, is trying to make sure that we keep the justice and the humanity and the ethic of care within justice as we're trying to set up and move forward within these moral codes. And so some of the weaknesses there for feminism, again, they're obviously known by the feminist thinkers. They're going to be something that they're trying to refine their theories. And so over, say, the next 10 years, as I'm talking about this, as I'm studying feminism, I expect that many of these issues, many of the weaknesses will be addressed, and their position will be further refined, and it will be better for it. And so through criticism, feminism hopefully will become better and stronger, and their moral voices, their ideas will be put forward in even a better way, so that we can benefit from the insights, and we can benefit from what it is that they're bringing to our moral landscape and to our moral table here in this situation. All right, so that is feminism and what it has to offer, and then also some thoughts on some of the weaknesses, some of the places that, hey, we need more thought, we need more refining in these particular areas. So hopefully, as you're thinking about feminism, as you're thinking about what they do bring to the table, you get something positive from it, and then also it helps you as you're thinking about your moral voice, or you're thinking about your moral theory, trying to frame those things up in your head. Hopefully these thoughts will have an impact on you as you're doing that as well. And I will see you next time.